In the small town of Willowbrook, everyone knew Jack and his loyal companion, Duke, a golden retriever with a heart as golden as his coat. Jack, a retired firefighter, had saved countless lives over his career, and Duke had been by his side through it all. From the time he was a pup, Duke had this uncanny bond with Jack, always sensing his moods, his moments of joy, and those quiet times of sorrow he tried so hard to hide. To the townsfolk, they were inseparable, a duo that embodied courage, love, and resilience. Jack lived a quiet life in a modest little house on the edge of town, surrounded by the woods he and Duke loved to explore. They had a routine that never faltered: morning coffee on the porch, long walks in the forest, and evenings spent by the fire, where Jack would often recount stories of his days at the fire station. Duke would sit attentively, his eyes wide, as if he could understand every word, every memory Jack shared. In truth, Duke wasn't just a pet. He was Jack's confidant, his friend, and, in many ways, his lifeline. But life has a way of throwing storms into even the calmest of lives. It was on one of those seemingly ordinary days that Jack began to feel unwell. At first, it was just a slight dizziness, a weakness he couldn't shake. Duke noticed instantly. The retriever would stay close to Jack, his head resting on Jack's lap, eyes filled with worry. Jack brushed it off, chalking it up to getting older. But Duke sensed something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his bones. Every time Jack tried to get up, Duke would nudge him gently, as if trying to tell him to rest, to take care of himself. When Jack finally agreed to see a doctor, the news was grim. He had a heart condition that had gone undiagnosed for years, silently growing, waiting to strike. The doctor recommended immediate hospitalization. Jack resisted at first, worried about Duke being left alone. He looked into those big, trusting eyes and whispered, "Don't worry, Duke. I'll be back soon." But even as he spoke, a heaviness settled over him, as if he was saying goodbye. Duke watched as Jack climbed into the ambulance, his tail wagging uncertainly, ears pricked up, sensing the change. And as the ambulance drove away, Duke did something that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Instead of going back to the house, he took off running, his paws pounding against the pavement, his gaze fixed on the flashing red lights. He chased the ambulance through the streets, dodging cars, ignoring the calls of passers-by, until he reached the hospital entrance. And there, on the steps outside, he waited. At first, the hospital staff found it odd, a lone dog, sitting patiently by the entrance, eyes fixed on the glass doors as if expecting someone to walk out at any moment. People came and went, and some tried to shoo him away, but Duke wouldn't budge. Hours turned into days, and still, Duke held his post, his loyalty unwavering. Nurses and doctors began to take notice, touched by the dog's silent vigil. Some tried to coax him inside, to give him food and water, but Duke barely ate. His entire being was focused on one thing: waiting for Jack to come back through those doors. The townsfolk soon heard about Duke's vigil. Strangers stopped by, bringing food, blankets, and offering words of encouragement. Local children would come and sit by him, telling him that Jack would be okay, that he'd be back soon. But Duke's gaze never wavered from the entrance, his faith as constant as the sunrise and sunset each day he waited. It was as if he had made a silent promise to Jack, one he was determined to keep. Inside, Jack was fighting his own battle. Each day, he grew weaker, his body struggling against the silent enemy that had crept into his life. Yet, as his strength waned, his thoughts kept returning to Duke, that faithful friend who had never left his side. One of the nurses noticed this and told Jack about the dog waiting outside. "That dog of yours, he hasn't moved an inch since you got here," she whispered, her eyes misting with tears. Jack's heart swelled with both pride and sorrow. He knew Duke would wait for him, no matter how long it took. Days passed, and Duke's resolve never wavered. The world outside the hospital seemed to fade away as he remained on the steps, through rain, wind, and cold nights. Some nights, passers-by would see him lying there, eyes closed, but the slightest sound of the hospital doors opening would make him lift his head, ears perked, hoping it was Jack coming back to him. The bond between Jack and Duke became a story the whole town followed closely. People prayed for Jack's recovery, and local newspapers wrote about the incredible devotion of a dog who wouldn't give up. For everyone who passed by, Duke was a reminder of love's endurance, a silent testament to the power of loyalty that transcended words or understanding. But while people admired Duke's loyalty, there were moments when even he grew weary. Late at night, when the streets were silent and dark, he would lay his head on his paws, his eyes heavy, his body worn from the weight. Yet, even in those moments of weakness, something deep within him kept him there. It was as if Duke understood, in a way only he could, that he had to be there. For Jack. For the promise they had made without words. Days turned into a week, and the toll of waiting began to show on Duke. His golden fur, once bright and shiny, dulled under the strain of sleepless nights and endless watchfulness. Each morning, he would stretch his legs and then resume his spot by the hospital doors, unwilling to move from his post. Those who stopped to see him noticed the quiet sadness in his eyes, the weight of his patience as he waited for any sign of Jack. Inside, Jack's condition was worsening. The doctors were concerned that his heart might not hold out without a risky procedure, one that Jack was hesitant to undertake. He knew the odds weren't in his favor, and the thought of not returning to Duke, of not seeing his faithful friend again, was almost too much to bear. Nurses and doctors spoke kindly to him, assuring him they were doing all they could, but he could feel his strength slipping with each passing day. Jack found himself clinging to memories of Duke, replaying their walks through the forest, the quiet evenings by the fire, and those comforting moments when Duke would simply sit beside him, sharing his presence without a word. It was in these memories that Jack found solace and a sliver of strength, knowing that Duke was out there, waiting for him. One evening, a nurse named Emma, moved by Duke's vigil, decided to bring the dog to a small garden outside Jack's room. She believed that seeing Jack might give Duke some comfort, a small reassurance that his wait would not be in vain. Carefully, she led Duke through the winding hospital corridors, each step echoing his silent anticipation. When they reached the garden, Duke immediately perked up, sensing Jack's presence through the glass window. Jack, weak and pale, looked up from his bed and saw his beloved friend standing just outside, his tail giving a faint wag despite his exhaustion. Jack's eyes filled with tears, and he raised a trembling hand to the window, pressing it softly against the glass. Duke, sensing his pain, nudged the glass with his nose, a gentle reminder of their bond, of the friendship that had brought them both through so much. But as the days passed, Duke's strength began to wane. The lack of proper rest, food, and the emotional strain of waiting were taking a toll on him. Some of the nurses and hospital staff took turns bringing him food, but he would only eat small bites, his appetite diminished by worry. At night, he would curl up on a makeshift bed made from a blanket someone had brought him, his body curled tightly, as though trying to hold on to some warmth and comfort. Duke's eyes, once filled with boundless energy, now held a depth of sadness that touched everyone who passed by. He would sometimes whimper softly, a sound that broke the hearts of those who heard it. Children would sit beside him, stroking his fur, whispering words of encouragement, telling him that Jack would be okay, that he just needed a little more time. Duke would listen, his eyes wide, as if he understood every word, holding on to every hopeful promise. But Jack's condition continued to worsen. Each time a nurse entered his room, he would ask about Duke, his voice frail but filled with the unmistakable concern of a man who felt his friend's pain even from a distance. The doctors were now urging Jack to consent to the procedure that could save his life, explaining the risks and the chance he might not survive without it. Yet Jack hesitated, fearful of the outcome but equally afraid of leaving Duke waiting in vain. One evening, as a storm rolled in, Duke remained steadfast outside the hospital doors. The wind howled and rain poured down, drenching his fur and chilling him to the bone. Despite the harsh weather, he did not seek shelter. He lay there, soaked and shivering, his gaze fixed on the entrance, a silent promise that he would not leave Jack, not even when the world around him seemed to fall apart. Staff members rushed out with umbrellas, trying to coax him inside, but Duke refused, his eyes never leaving the doors. Inside, Jack, weakened and barely able to speak, could sense Duke's suffering. He could almost feel the rain on his own skin, as if their hearts were bound together by an invisible thread that neither time nor distance could break. The storm seemed like a cruel reminder of the battle he faced, a battle that now felt as though it would tear him from the one friend he had left in this world. It was during that stormy night that Jack finally made a decision. He called Emma, the nurse who had been kind to Duke, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked her to look after his friend if he didn't make it through. His words were thick with emotion as he expressed his fears, his hope, and the gratitude he felt for Duke's unwavering love. Emma promised, her own voice choked with emotion, assuring him that she would make sure Duke was cared for, no matter what happened. When morning came, Duke was still there, curled up and drenched, his body trembling from the cold. People stopped, astonished by his endurance, by the sheer force of love that kept him by the hospital doors. Some wept openly, touched by the sight of a dog so devoted, so steadfast in his loyalty. They saw in Duke a rare kind of love, one that did not waver, did not weaken, even when faced with unimaginable hardship. Finally, the doctors told Jack that the time for the procedure had come. It was now or never, a final chance to save his life. Jack closed his eyes, his mind filled with memories of Duke, and he silently prayed for the strength to make it through. He knew, deep down, that Duke was waiting, and that was enough for him to try, to fight, even when hope felt like a distant memory. As Jack was wheeled into surgery, Duke felt a shift, a strange sense that something was happening, though he could not see or understand what it was. His ears perked up, his gaze even more intense, as he continued his vigil, a silent guardian waiting for a friend who meant the world to him. The townsfolk gathered, offering silent prayers and hopeful words, their hearts breaking as they watched Duke wait, his loyalty unshaken, even as he grew weaker by the day. He had become a symbol, a beacon of hope and love that transcended words, a reminder that sometimes, love is the only force strong enough to withstand the storms of life. Hours felt like days as Duke remained stationed outside the hospital, his gaze fixed intently on the doors as if sheer willpower alone could bring Jack back. His faithful watch had become a story of its own, spreading across town and even catching the attention of nearby news stations. People from neighboring towns arrived to see the loyal golden retriever who refused to leave his spot. Strangers would sit beside him, whispering gentle words of encouragement, but Duke was almost oblivious, lost in the anticipation of seeing Jack again. Inside the hospital, Jack was in surgery, his body fragile yet clinging to life. As the doctors worked tirelessly to repair his damaged heart, it seemed as if a silent battle was being waged, a test of endurance and strength. Jack's thoughts drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind hazy with memories of Duke. He could almost feel Duke beside him, as if his presence gave him the courage he needed to fight. Outside, the weather took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds gathered, and a bitter wind swept through the hospital grounds, cutting through the air like a reminder of the uncertainty that loomed over both Jack and Duke. Emma, the kind nurse who had taken a special interest in the dog, worried about Duke's health as much as she did Jack's. She had tried several times to bring him inside, to offer warmth and shelter, but Duke resisted every attempt. His place was by the doors, his silent promise to Jack binding him there, no matter the conditions. As the wind picked up, Duke shivered, his damp fur doing little to shield him from the cold. A few locals rushed to place blankets around him, but Duke's focus remained unbroken, his eyes locked on the entrance as if any moment Jack might walk out, safe and sound. For those watching, it was an emotional sight, a testament to the loyalty that only a dog could demonstrate, a loyalty so deep that it defied the harshness of nature itself. Meanwhile, in the operating room, Jack's condition wavered. The doctors fought against the odds, but there was a critical moment when his heart rate dropped and everything seemed to pause. It was as though life itself held its breath, caught between hope and despair. Yet, somewhere in Jack's mind, he felt Duke's presence, a comforting warmth that reminded him he had something worth fighting for. Even in his weakened state, he could feel the pull of that bond, the enduring love that had carried him through dark times before. The surgeons persisted, and after hours of careful work, they managed to stabilize Jack. His heart began to beat with renewed strength, a fragile yet hopeful rhythm. The doctors exchanged weary but relieved glances, their faces reflecting the intense journey of bringing Jack back from the brink. But while they had done all they could medically, they knew that Jack's recovery was only beginning. He would need time, rest, and a reason to hold on. Little did they know that reason was waiting just outside, shivering in the cold. As Jack was wheeled out of surgery and into the recovery room, word quickly spread through the hospital. Emma was one of the first to hear and, without hesitation, she hurried to Duke's side. She knelt beside him, gently wrapping another blanket around his body and speaking softly, "Duke, Jack's out of surgery. He's fighting for you, just like you're fighting for him." Duke looked up at her, his eyes tired but filled with a glimmer of hope, as if he understood her words. The next few days were critical. Jack's body was fragile, his recovery uncertain. But each day, the doctors and nurses noticed a subtle change in him, a spark of determination that seemed to grow with each passing hour. They began to realize that Jack's strength was fueled by something outside of the medicine and machinery, by the loyalty of a friend who waited tirelessly, giving Jack the will to keep fighting. Finally, as Jack regained enough strength to speak, he asked Emma about Duke. "Is he still there?" he whispered, his voice weak but filled with longing. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Yes, Jack. He's waiting for you, every day, just outside those doors." The words seemed to fill Jack with a sense of purpose, a reason to push through the pain and exhaustion. He knew that Duke's faith in him was unwavering, and he couldn't let his friend down. One afternoon, as Jack continued his slow recovery, Emma and a doctor arranged for a brief reunion in the small garden. They knew that seeing each other, even for a moment, could be the key to both Jack's and Duke's healing. When Duke was finally led to the garden, his entire body seemed to vibrate with anticipation, his eyes wide, searching. Then he saw Jack, weak and pale, but very much alive. Jack was seated in a wheelchair, his face drawn but lit with an unmistakable joy as he saw his faithful friend bounding toward him. Duke's tail wagged wildly, and he whimpered, a sound that carried all the emotions he couldn't express. Jack reached out, his hand trembling, and Duke nuzzled against it, his soft fur soaking up the warmth of Jack's touch. For a long moment, they simply stayed that way, two friends reunited after a trial that had tested the depths of their bond. Tears filled Jack's eyes as he whispered, "You never gave up on me, did you, Duke?" The dog looked up at him, his eyes filled with a quiet strength, as if he understood the journey they had been on together. It was a reunion that everyone present would remember, a moment that spoke of love's power to heal, even when words weren't enough. As they spent those precious minutes together, something shifted in Jack. He felt a surge of strength, a newfound determination to recover not just for himself, but for Duke, the friend who had waited through rain, cold, and uncertainty. It was as if Duke's loyalty had breathed life back into him, giving him the courage he needed to keep going. Emma and the staff watched in awe, touched by the unspoken bond between man and dog. They saw, in that moment, a kind of love that transcended even the deepest of hardships, a love that had brought Jack back from the brink and given Duke the peace he needed. When the visit ended, Duke returned to his post by the hospital doors, but this time there was a lightness to his steps, a spark of hope in his eyes. He knew, in a way only he could, that Jack would come back to him, that the days of waiting were coming to an end. The days following their reunion marked a turning point for both Jack and Duke. Jack, though still weak, felt a renewed strength course through him, fueled by the quiet but powerful presence of his loyal friend. He dedicated himself to his recovery, knowing that Duke was counting on him. Every day brought small milestones, an extra step, a stronger heartbeat, a glimmer of life that seemed to grow each time he thought of Duke waiting patiently outside. For Duke, those days were filled with anticipation. He maintained his post by the hospital doors, but there was a newfound lightness to his vigil, as if he knew that each passing moment brought him closer to Jack. Hospital staff and townsfolk continued to support him, offering warm blankets, fresh food, and gentle encouragement. Duke, however, seemed to have eyes only for the entrance, waiting for the day when he and Jack would leave together. Inside, the doctors and nurses marveled at Jack's recovery. His progress was nothing short of remarkable. Though he faced countless hurdles, fatigue, weakness, and moments of doubt, Jack's resolve was unbreakable. Every time he faltered, he would think of Duke's unwavering presence, his silent strength, and the loyalty that had kept him outside those hospital doors through every hardship. This love, Jack realized, was as much a medicine as anything the doctors could offer. It was as if Duke's faith in him had given him the courage to face the impossible. Emma, the nurse who had watched over both Jack and Duke, often brought news of Duke's well-being to Jack, sharing stories of the dog's steadfast watch and the visitors who came from miles around to see him. "He's become a hero," she'd say with a smile, "just like his owner." These words filled Jack with pride, and he would close his eyes, imagining the day he could finally walk out of the hospital with Duke by his side. One evening, Emma arranged for another visit in the garden. This time, Jack was strong enough to walk, albeit with the help of a cane. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, Duke's head shot up, his eyes immediately finding Jack. With a joyful bark, Duke raced to him, his body a blur of golden fur and boundless energy. Jack laughed, the sound filling the garden as Duke circled him, his tail wagging with uncontainable joy. This second reunion was even more emotional than the first. Jack knelt down, his hand resting on Duke's head, feeling the warmth of his fur and the steady beat of his friend's heart. "You've been my strength, Duke," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how I could have done this without you." Duke looked up, his eyes filled with a wisdom beyond his years, as if he understood every word, every struggle they had endured together. Over the following weeks, Jack's recovery accelerated. He walked a little further each day, building his strength with each step. Duke's presence became a regular part of his therapy, with doctors encouraging the visits, knowing the profound impact the dog had on Jack's healing. Duke, in turn, seemed to sense Jack's growing strength, greeting him with playful nudges and gentle licks, encouraging him with every wag of his tail. As Jack's discharge date approached, the news spread through Willowbrook. The townsfolk gathered in support, excited for the day when Jack and Duke would finally be reunited in full health. The local newspaper wrote an article about their journey, dubbing Duke the hero dog of Willowbrook and highlighting the extraordinary love that had saved a man's life. On the day of his discharge, Jack stood at the hospital doors, taking in the moment with a deep breath. He looked down at Duke, who sat by his side, his eyes shining with pride and joy. The entire hospital staff gathered around, clapping and cheering as Jack took his first steps outside with Duke walking proudly beside him. It was a triumphant moment, a testament to resilience, loyalty, and the power of love that had carried them both through the darkest days. The first place Jack and Duke visited was the forest trail they had walked so many times before. Though Jack was slower now, Duke matched his pace, staying close as they strolled beneath the towering trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in golden patches that seemed to mirror Duke's coat. They walked in silence, each step a quiet celebration of their journey, a reminder of the bond that had brought them through. As they reached a familiar clearing, Jack stopped and knelt down beside Duke. "We made it, didn't we, boy?" he whispered, his voice breaking as he spoke. Duke leaned into him, his eyes filled with a deep understanding that words could never capture. In that moment, they both knew that this was more than a return to their old life. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one built on the foundation of a love that had weathered every storm. Back in town, they were welcomed like heroes. People cheered, children ran to pet Duke, and elderly neighbors wiped tears from their eyes as they watched the pair walk down the main street. Jack, though still recovering, held his head high, his heart filled with gratitude for the friends who had supported them and for the dog who had been his constant, his strength, and his hope. Life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Jack and Duke resumed their daily routines, their bond stronger than ever. But there was a difference now, a quiet understanding between them, a reminder of the days they had fought through, the challenges they had overcome together. Duke would often look at Jack with a knowing glance, his eyes reflecting the journey they had shared, a journey that had brought them closer than ever. Over time, their story became a cherished part of Willowbrook's lore. Children would ask to hear the tale of the dog that waited, captivated by Duke's courage and Jack's determination. Their story served as a reminder to everyone in town of the strength found in friendship, of the unbreakable bonds that can carry us through even the darkest moments. And for Jack and Duke, every day was a quiet celebration of the life they had reclaimed together. Jack would often sit on the porch, Duke resting by his side, watching the sun dip below the horizon. In those peaceful moments, they needed no words. Their journey had given them something beyond language, a trust, a love, and a loyalty that would remain with them for as long as they walked this earth together. As the years passed, the story of Jack and Duke became a symbol of loyalty and resilience in Willowbrook. People who had once only known them as the man and his dog now saw them as beacons of hope. For Jack, every moment with Duke was a reminder of the battle they'd fought together, the long days of waiting, the quiet strength they had found in each other. And for Duke, each day by Jack's side was another chapter of the life they had both fought so hard to reclaim. Jack often thought back to the dark days in the hospital and the silent promise Duke had made to him. That promise, kept through rain, cold, and uncertainty, had given him the strength to push through his own fears. In Duke, Jack had found not just a friend, but a reflection of the kind of love that does not waver, that stands strong in the face of every trial. Their journey left an indelible mark on those who heard it. Strangers were inspired by the tale of a dog who never gave up, who reminded them that true loyalty requires no words, only the quiet endurance of the heart. For Jack and Duke, their story wasn't just about survival. It was a testament to the power of love, a love that had brought them through the hardest of times and continued to guide them, step by step, every day. And in the end, as they sat together watching the sun set, Jack would often rest his hand on Duke's head and whisper, "Thank you, Duke, for everything." And Duke, in his quiet way, would lean closer as if to say, "I'd wait for you all over again." It's an honor to be able to create content for you. If you want to support the channel even more, you can follow the instructions that I will leave on the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Love you all.